Remember Windsurf, the $3 billion VS Code fork that was about to be purchased by OpenAI 2 months ago? I do, and I've been waiting for the update on that for a while. And today we got that update. The deals finally went through. And now they are working... Big welcome to Varun and others from the Windsurf team joining DeepMind. DeepMind's the Google thing. What happened? This one is utter chaos. I've been going out of my way to collect every source, talk to everyone I can just to figure out what happened here. Why did the OpenAI deal fail? When did Google come in? What has Google done? And where is this all going? As mentioned in this tweet, this isn't an acquisition. This is a bunch of the people from Windsurf, including the CEO, leaving for Google. Windsurf still exists and is not part of Google. So what happened here? Because this means a lot of people potentially are getting screwed. This says a ton about the market, the way that Google is thinking about competing with other companies. OpenAI didn't do the acquisition, so what happened there? We have a lot to dive into here, like even more than usual. I'm currently filming at 8:30 p.m. on a Friday because I just want to make sure that this stuff is covered responsibly, and I think there's a ton of misinformation going around. All of that said, I only stand to lose money from this, so a quick word from today's sponsor, and then we'll dive into all of the chaos going on right now. There have been some unexpected consequences of these AI tools infecting my workplace. I feel like there are way more PRs than we've ever had before. I think we have like 50 open right now. Each of those is triggering CI. Those CI runs take a bunch of time. We're all stuck sitting there and waiting and paying a bunch of money. Hell, I'm spending more on CI than I used to spend on individual engineers. It's crazy how big these bills have gotten because we're just doing so many builds. That is, until I switch to today's sponsor, Blacksmith. These guys will help you out a ton if you're in the same boat as us doing way more builds than ever. They'll cut your costs by as much as 75%, and they'll cut your build times in half too. Must be super complex to set up, right? Nope, you change one line of code in your GitHub action. Well, it has to be super expensive. Wait, no, it's not. It's 75% cheaper. There's a bunch of little things they do that make it so much faster. My favorite is that they're using gaming processors like CPUs. They're doing it for a reason. Traditional server CPUs are really slow on the single thread. They're focused on having as many cores as possible, but the stuff that you and I are building benefits a lot from having a fast single core, so they can run way faster than you can on GitHub's old archaic servers. Their cache downloads are also hilariously faster, up to 4 times faster. We're talking 100 plus megabytes per second. In their Docker builds, since they're caching all of the layers on their NVMe co-located drives, they're up to 40 times faster. You can take my word for it, or you can check out a bunch of the companies that have already made the move, including Mintlify. Mintlify makes docs, and as you might know, docs tend to have pretty slow build times because they are generating a ton of content that's from Markdown to HTML, and they're usually using JavaScript to do it, which is not the fastest language for parsing a bunch of text, silly as that sounds. Mintlify is a phenomenal way to host your docs, and they were able to cut their bill and their CI times 2 times faster deployment, 50% savings in their CI. That's an 8-minute build down to a 4-minute build. The craziest thing they're doing, and I'm almost scared about putting this in because they might have to stop if y'all spam them enough. You don't even need a credit card to sign up. You get 3,000 free minutes a month for actually free. Not like free, but you need a credit card. For free. Seriously, why haven't you given it a shot yet? Check them out today at soidiv.link/blacksmith. To better understand what's happening here, we have to cover a couple not necessarily directly related things. Trust me, this will make it all make more sense. First, I'm going to talk about a different company. Just, again, hear me out. We're going to talk about Scale AI. If you're not already familiar, Scale is an absurdly successful startup focused on doing data stuff for AI. Primarily, it was originally selling data that you could use to train AI. They do a hell of a lot more now. They've been absurdly successful and one of the earlier AI companies as well. So why am I bringing these guys up right now? Well, they had a very interesting non-acquisition a couple weeks ago. This was one of the strangest deals that I've seen, and I think it will help you guys understand a bit more of what's going on. So Meta invested $14 billion into Scale AI. Why would they do that? The reason's actually quite interesting, and it's not necessarily because of Scale as a business. It's actually about Scale as a team that Meta and Mark Zuckerberg seemingly personally had interest in. This deal gave Meta a 49% stake in the data labeling startup, while bringing the Scale AI founder, Alexander Wang, into Meta's leadership to head a new superintelligence research lab. This is the real interesting detail. The trade that happened here is Meta bought just under 50% of the company, so they're not the majority shareholder. They just have a lot of say and vote. And part of the trade was that they would bring the CEO and founder of Scale AI over. What the hell? This is a crazy deal, but it represents a huge thing going on in this world right now. It's poaching season. What do I mean by that? Well, you've probably all seen the crazy deals floating around of Meta paying top researchers from companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, and more hundreds of millions of dollars as individuals to come join Meta and try to get them caught up in the AI research like chaos. Meta fell behind really fast. They made bets that weren't good, and now they're struggling to keep up with the lead research labs. As such, they need to spend a lot of money in order to try and catch up, and they're willing to do things that are absurd. And let's be real, it doesn't matter how well compensated you are at a company like OpenAI. If somebody offers you $100 million to quit, you're going to do it. And that's how a lot of these companies are starting to think. There were some other similarly crazy deals happening recently, not necessarily in the hundreds of millions per person, but probably not too far off. One of them that comes to mind is actually around Claude, Code, and Cursor. The relationship between Anthropic and Cursor is chaotic now to the point where I feel like I need to do my own separate video about just that. We'll get there in a bit. But one of the parts of that drama is that the creators of Claude Code, like the original two that led the team and made it happen, they both got poached and now work at Cursor. Everyone's poaching everyone from everywhere, and they're spending a ton of money in order to do it, giving away absurd levels of equity, usually on cliffs, all the usual stuff there. The reason for all that is finding really advanced talent for creating AI and AI experiences is not easy. These aren't traditional engineering roles, like understanding the way these pieces come together and also the research side behind it. Some of these researchers have been studying AI for 20 plus years. You can't just learn that in a weekend the way you can a new framework. If your company's moving to React, you can hire a bunch of Angular engineers and teach them React pretty quick. If your company's trying to build an AI model, you need people who have been in the trenches for a while. If your company's trying to build a complex AI tool that uses a bunch of agents, it's going to take you at least a few months to a few years to figure out how those parts come together and do it right. If your company needs a ton of data for the training of these AIs, you can't just take a random data engineer and hope they know what they're doing. You need someone who's led teams that do that as well. These are all the pieces that are complex enough that it's just not worth hoping you're going to find success in it. And these really big successful companies like OpenAI, Meta, and now to an extent even Cursor are willing to spend disgusting amounts of money in order to maximize the likelihood that they have a good outcome at the end of this crazy AI race. I really want to focus in on this Scale AI acquisition, though. There have been a couple deals like this recently. There was also Character AI with Google, Inflection AI with Microsoft, Adept with Amazon, and Covariant as well. The thing I want to emphasize here is how this deal went. Alex was pulled in to lead the Meta Superintelligence Lab. Scale remains independent, valued at around $30 billion. Because again, Meta was down to put, 14.9 bill? 14.3 bill. They put in 14.3 bill for 49%. That means the company is worth 14.3 times roughly 2, so 28.6 to $30 billion. That's a really high valuation. But that valuation doesn't necessarily mean anything because people on the other side of the 49%, the ones who own the other 51%, might not be able to sell that or do anything with it. At least usually. But this is not the case with what happened here. This was a partial acquisition. Meta wasn't investing into Scale AI. They were purchasing a chunk of Scale AI. And through this purchase, they allowed anybody at the company, including a bunch of investors, the opportunity to sell their ownership in shares so that they could finally cash out. So if you were an early employee in Scale and you had like 0.5 to 1% equity, that might have been worth a few $1,000s when you joined. That's now worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You had the opportunity to sell a little bit of it to Meta during this transition. So there was a bunch of these early employees, founders, and whatnot that worked at Scale that had the opportunity and probably took it to turn that investment into cash or trade it for Meta stock because they can hold that and sell it whenever. Something you should understand about these early stage companies is that you can't cash out until they have an event that allows you to cash out. Usually that is an acquisition or an IPO. So if you invest, $100,000 into a company that's worth $1 million as an early stage company, you own 10%. But you don't actually own anything if you're investing in most of the traditional early stage investing methodologies. This is an IOU. If the company ends up actually only being worth $500,000, depending on the way that you did that investment, there's a good chance you did it through a future equity vehicle like a SAFE. Instead of this converting as 10% of the company, this money that you invested will convert as 20% because this hasn't cashed out yet. But if the company ends up selling for $10 million, you bought at the 1 mil valuation, so this will convert to be a much higher value, in this case, $1 million. You aren't buying actual equity in the company for a lot of this early stage investment. You're giving the money as an IOU in hopes that you can cash it out later. That said, we're just talking like early stage seed and pre-seed there. After that, you end up in the Series A, B, and C, which tend to be more traditional stock purchases. So if you invest when they're worth $1 million and then they want to go raise some more money, that might be a Series A, and that might be at a real high valuation, like 80 mil or 200 mil. At that point, stock will be issued. You would get stock based on this ratio, so you have the equity, but it's privately held equity, and chances are the company is not allowing you to sell that yet. There are markets that allow you to do secondary sales of these things, but those are sketchy and sometimes even have legal problems, so they generally are avoided. Investors don't get the opportunity to cash out their shares effectively until the founder chooses that it's time. So they might raise at another valuation, then a Series B, C, D, etc., and then eventually something has to happen. There's a lot of different paths that can go. The company can fail and nobody gets anything, or they bankrupt and assets are shoveled away at a loss in hopes some investors can get something. And usually through those acquisitions, there's a stock trade or a cash purchase that allows this equity to become something else. Or they can IPO, and now anyone can sell the shares that they have at any point they feel like, because it's in a public trading market. So when a private company buys a company like this, let's say, I don't know, this company actually ends up being worth $3 billion. And this $3 billion acquisition is through a company like OpenAI. OpenAI is not publicly traded, which means that this $3 billion probably isn't going to be cash. It's probably going to be largely equity. They're effectively taking $3 billion of OpenAI stock, which isn't real. You can't trade it yet. It's a theoretical valuation for it. They're taking those $3 billion of OpenAI stock and handing that out to the shareholders across Windsurf. So if the founders have 50%, they now have $1.5 billion of OpenAI stock instead of having $1.5 billion of Windsurf stock. And honestly, I can understand why they would want to take that deal. Any other employees of the company, investors as well, would have a similar trade. So if you invested when they were worth 300 million and then the trade is happening for 3 billion, you can times 10 whatever you invested in them and you have that much stock in OpenAI. So again, just to do these numbers so it's easy to understand, if you invested $30,000 in them and they were worth 300 million at the time as a theoretical valuation, you now own 0.1%. But what's more important is the multiplier here. A zero was added when OpenAI theoretically could have acquired them, which means I would have went from having $300,000 of Windsurf stock that I can't do anything with to having $3 million of OpenAI stock that I also can't really do anything with. That said, a lot of these companies have values that are going to convert at some point. So what a lot of people will do is they'll take out loans against the equity. Since I have, in this theoretical case, $3 million of stock in OpenAI, most banks will see that and be like, okay, there's a good chance that's going to be worth something someday. So if I want to go buy a house for $1 million, I can do a loan against this investment that I have because it will eventually be worth something. Probably. Why am I talking about all these in the weed details for a deal that failed? I'm trying to set the stage for how these things usually go. So if you were an early stage employee at Windsurf, you have some amount of equity that you got as part of joining Windsurf. That isn't technically really worth anything until you have the chance to cash out. Same deal with a company like Scale AI, who we were just talking about before. There were a lot of founders and early stage employees that had a bunch of equity that they couldn't really do anything with. A thing that's pretty common when these bigger investment deals occur is that they allow for employees to choose to sell some of their stock in that process. If a firm like, I don't know, Anderson Horowitz, A16Z, comes in to a deal with, I don't know, let's just say Cursor, because that's one that's recent and makes a lot of sense. If A16 comes in, they're like, we want to own 10% of Cursor. We're willing to spend $100 million for that. So they're going to spend 100 mil to get 10% of Cursor. That would make the valuation $1 billion. There's a couple different ways they could do that, but what usually happens for these later stages is more stock is issued. So let's say that this chunk is investors own it. They own, right now, we'll say that 20% is currently owned by investors. We'll say 5% is the employee pool. So for employees, new hires, etc., 5% of the equity for the company is owned by them for all of those purposes. And then the rest would be the founder's money. So whoever were the people who started, in this case, Cursor, they would have the remaining 75%. So this is the current state of the company's stock. Founders own the majority. Most founders go out of their way to try and keep the majority of their company, as they should. If they don't own a huge chunk of the company, the incentive for them to keep working on it goes down, which is an important detail we'll be talking about momentarily. A split like this is not uncommon. Sometimes investors get significantly higher percentages. Sometimes they don't. Usually they'll be between 20 and 50% at any given stage for a Series A or later company. So if A16 comes in and they're like, okay, we want 10%. Where do they take it from? Founders don't want to give up their stock. Other investors might, but they're not going to do that just yet. And part of the raise is that the company wants the money. So if A16 says, we're going to pour $100 million into this company, the company wants the money. But if the founders take it, it's their money. If the investors take it, the company doesn't get any money. And if the employee pool gets it, the company also doesn't get any money. So what usually ends up happening here is they dilute the table. What that means is additional stock is issued. Let's say that right here they had, they had 100 million stock units. Like they had 100 million RSUs for the company at this point in time. A16 wants 10%. I'm going to be lazy and make this a little easier for me. We'll say they have 90 million stock units, and that's split the way I show here. A16 wants 10%. So what they can do now is expand by 10%. They'll issue another 10 million shares, and now there's 100 million shares. This new 10% that we just carved out at the end here, this is what will be going to A16. But now this no longer adds up to 100%. This is now 110%. That's because everything else gets diluted as the result. That's how dilution works. When more money is raised, more stock is created, because at any point in time, the board can decide they want to create and just invent more equity in the company. You have to be cautious of this, because when you do that, you are lowering the value of other equity. So ideally, you do an event like this where the company's value is now higher. So if A16 is putting 100 mil in to get 10%, yes, these other people now are 10% less. So you go from 20 to 18% here. You go from 5 to 4.5% here. And you go from 75 to 68.5, I think. Math is hard. Okay, you get the idea. This 10% means 10% of these percentages goes down. But if the company was only worth 500 million, I would rather have 68% of $1 billion than have 75% of $500 million. That's how all of this works. The reason I brought all of this up is they don't necessarily have to get their 10% purely through expanding the number of shares. If they want their 10%, it's not uncommon to do something like this, where they get 9% of that 10% through this creation of additional stock. So instead of doing 10 million new shares, they'll do 9 million new shares. And then they will buy the remaining shares that they need through these other groups. The founders might sell a bit, the employees might sell a bit, and the investors might sell a bit. Generally speaking, employees take the top precedent because they're not being paid hundreds of millions of dollars. So if you have stock that when you joined was worth 20K and now it's worth 2 million, you might be down to sell half of that for $1 million and suddenly have way more money in the bank. And if that's 1 million of the 100 mil A16 puts in, nobody sweats, everyone's happy, and it shows to the employees that you do want them to succeed. That's why it's common for in these later stage big number investments that some percentage of this goes to these what are called secondary sales, where instead of the company creating stock to sell it to the investor to raise this money, they're allowing some amount of it to go to other parties. And the goal again is so that the company investing can get the percentage that they're looking for, the company raising can get the money they need to keep going, and so the individuals who own shares can get some amount of cash during this. As you can imagine, the OpenAI acquisition of Windsurf would have been a pretty solid opportunity for people who had invested or worked there, or especially for the founders, to get a nice payday. Even if they couldn't do it through a cash out like this, they could have, again, as I mentioned before, take out loans and do all those other things. They were probably starting to look forward to getting that opportunity. That opportunity didn't happen. One last time, let's talk about Scale AI a little more. The interesting thing that happened with Scale AI is that they didn't raise money, at least in the traditional sense. They're already profitable, they're doing very well, they're growing fast, but they were worth a lot of money. And if Zuckerberg wanted the founder of Scale AI to help him out, he had to find a way to bring him over that allowed him to justify it financially. If you run a company that's worth upwards of $30 billion, you're not going to just quit and go somewhere else, especially if you know how much that's going to hurt the investors, your reputation, the team, and everyone else involved. And that's why I actually quite like the way that they did this deal. Since Meta invested $14.3 billion for a 49% stake, they were able to let whoever wants sell some of that stock. So if Alex owned half of the company and he chose, I don't know, sell 10%, 50%, whatever of his shares, he can then sell that to Meta as part of this acquisition. Not acquisition, stake purchase. You get the idea. And any other employees, ex-founders, and even investors have the same opportunity where they can choose to effectively trade their stock for Meta stock or cash as part of this transaction. This is a big win because it means employees that are unsure about the company without Alex, like if you're an employee that's there because you really like Alex and you trust him and he's not going to be there anymore, you can choose to trade out your stock and go somewhere else now. Or if you're an investor that is concerned the company has no direction after this change, you can cash out and move on. Chances are the investors owned way less than 50%, which means if the investors own, I don't know, like 30%, and half of them decide to stay, half decide to go, you still have a bunch of money left over to give to founders, early employees, and whoever else. This is a really good deal because people who want to exit can exit, people who want to stay can stay. Meta gets who they want, which is Alex, as well as having a stake in a company that could potentially benefit them significantly. This is kind of an everyone wins deal. I know there are obviously losers when billionaires are trading back and forth like it's a fucking baseball card system, but you get the idea. There's no clear, obvious loser in a deal like this, and I honestly think that this was handled well considering the chaotic nature of a trade like this. So why am I talking about all of this? I'm talking about all of this because I want to make sure you guys have context on what has shifted here. If the original deal was $3 billion for OpenAI, everyone was probably getting pretty excited about that. But the deal failed. It's worth going into why the deal failed because this part is confusing. I've talked about this a little bit in the past. There was a very strange deal between OpenAI and Microsoft. The deal that OpenAI and Microsoft have is Microsoft invests X billion. I don't remember how much, doesn't necessarily matter for the points I'm about to make here. They invest billions of dollars. MS gives OAI access to way more infra because they need as many GPUs and as many servers as possible to both train and serve their users, their models. And another important part of this deal, because again, remember OpenAI, you can't just own stock and expect it to convert traditionally. They have their caps and whatnot. The other part of this deal was that Microsoft gets rights to all IP developed at OpenAI until AGI is achieved. So until OpenAI hits this definition of AGI that OpenAI and Microsoft agreed to, any new IP developed at OpenAI is also something Microsoft has access to. This has caused a ton of drama back and forth between Microsoft and OpenAI, and it's a big part of why their relationship is starting to fracture. This got really bad during the OpenAI O model reveal, specifically O1, into this concept of reasoning that they pushed really hard. They didn't give any of the information to Microsoft, and that caused some real bad blood between these guys. So what's going on here? Windsurf, as you guys know, is a VS Code fork. They're a VS Code fork that has their own IP and things they've done and invented in order to make editing with agents and AI a better experience. If Windsurf was to be acquired by OpenAI, it's now part of this deal. Hypothetically, because again, I haven't gotten this as a formal detail from anyone directly involved. This is secondary and tertiary information from people I do trust, but I don't have a good source I can link you to because this isn't information that is public. This is my understanding of things based on the reporting that I've been able to get from people independently. Microsoft would get Windsurf's IP as part of this trade. So if you believe that Windsurf has some novel technology that is worth the $3 billion that this acquisition would be for, that all, by default, gets sent to Microsoft as part of the agreement that they already have with OpenAI. Microsoft are the owners and creators of VS Code. This would effectively mean that Microsoft could fold all of Windsurf's work into VS Code for free. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer. These details aren't public. This is the key detail that almost certainly prevented this deal from happening. I wish we had more info. I wish you guys would be more transparent. I get why they can't be, though. There's a very, very good chance that Microsoft would have default gotten all of the IP from the acquisition, kind of making it valueless to OpenAI to do it. Because if they're buying Windsurf in order to keep up with developers, and now Microsoft gets all of the same benefits that OpenAI gets. That's just not a good transaction. That doesn't make sense for OpenAI. So this is almost certainly the detail that caused the deal to fail. My guess is they spent the last few months trying to fight it and failed, but an expectation was already set. Employees, investors, and founders all expected to be able to cash out some amount as part of this. They would either get this OpenAI stock at this absurd valuation, they can take loans out against it, they can sell it to OpenAI or to other people in a secondary market potentially. This would be a transaction where a lot of the people that are involved in Windsurf would theoretically get a lot of money and be in a really good position. They all probably started planning around this. I would be very surprised if there weren't a bunch of employees that were expecting this to happen and started looking for a new house to purchase or planning their own startups or getting excited to start investing or do the other things with this crazy amount of cash that they were expecting to get as part of this. And suddenly none of that happens. So imagine you're the founder of Windsurf. You were expecting to make some number of billions of dollars, or at the very least, to get some number of billions of dollars of OpenAI stock. You would no longer have to be on the startup grind of fighting to survive every day. Your team would be well taken care of. Your investors would be happy with everything that happened. And now you get to lead a team at a big, well-funded company and just focus on delivering solutions. You no longer have to worry about all these fundraising things, all of the chaos of the paperwork and all the other stuff that I have to deal with every day. Being a founder is not a glamorous life. It's mostly email and paperwork. As such, the founder, Varun, was probably getting pretty excited to have this exit. He'd probably mentally resigned some amount his role at Windsurf, which is why things have been so quiet from them for a while now. I can understand that he was probably very excited to just not worry about any of these things anymore and just grind on Windsurf, help OpenAI make better dev tools, and move on with his life. And now, for reasons that have almost nothing to do with him or his company, that can't happen. Understandably, that's a painful spot to be in. To expect literal billions of dollars and then get nothing. Ugh, that's not a fun spot to be in. As such, he was probably starting to talk to other places and consider other deals because he is mentally moved to this expected plan, and now the unexpected happened. So who could possibly acquire our friends over at Windsurf? OpenAI can't because of the Microsoft thing. Microsoft has no reason to because they already have VS Code and Copilot, and they're going to keep grinding there. Anthropic's certainly not going to do this after, especially when you saw how bad Anthropic treated Windsurf during the potential acquisition with OpenAI. They have no interest. I'm pretty sure Claude Code already has more users than Windsurf does anyways. So who has the most to stand benefit-wise from this acquisition? Google. And this is where things get very interesting. Google wants to win developers in the AI world. And to be frank, so does OpenAI. That's why they were considering this acquisition in the first place. That's why Codex, the CLI by OpenAI, is this big open source project that supports every model. That's why they're about to release their open model and why they're being transparent about the delays that just happened there. All of these companies are fighting to win developers. There's a reason. Anthropic's only edge is that developers like them. When you benchmark Anthropic models like Claude 4, Sonnet, and Opus on any traditional knowledge tasks, be it math, science, ArcAGI, Humanity's Last Benchmark, all of these things you can test models against, Anthropic models tend to not do well. But they do have some important strengths. They're good at writing code, and more importantly, they're really good at tool calls, which means if you tell an AI to do something like send an email in these conditions, here's the format that you should send me text that will then trigger an email send. Anthropic models have been the best at tool calling for a long time now. Claude 3.5 Sonnet was a revolution in this space specifically because 3.5 Sonnet was so much more reliable at doing these things that we could start building applications around this idea of tool calling and function calling. There's also stuff like MCP, the standard that Anthropic made to standardize tool calls across network boundaries and all sorts of other use cases too. Since the Anthropic models are best at tool calls, they're also the best for us as developers to integrate into our things. If you want to make an AI agent that can query against your database to find information and then filter that into something that a user can see, Anthropic models are probably your best bet. If you're building an AI coding tool that can grep your code base, find something, and then apply a diff via yet another tool, Anthropic models are your best bet. If you're doing anything that requires code to be run by the model, Anthropic models tend to be your best bet. even if they're not the smartest, even if they're not the cheapest, even if they're not the nicest to use, even if they're one of the slowest options. Their reliability with tool calls has made them the choice for developers. And the fact that they're also good at code means that they're the models we're using to write code. You'll see whenever I hop into my editor, which is admittedly still Cursor, I'm an investor, so I'm biased. Doesn't really matter here, though. I'm using Claude 4 Sonnet. I love talking crap on Anthropic, but there's no crap to talk here. They are really good at this in particular. They're good at using the tools in your editor and writing code in general, and the result is that developers default to Anthropic models. Both OpenAI and Google have recognized that they are behind in this space. OpenAI in particular fell real far behind because they didn't know any of this was going to be so important. They were too focused on making the models as smart as possible. So starting earlier this year with the drops of models like O3 Mini, O4 Mini, GPT 4.1, as well as Codex, a lot more focus was put in from OpenAI in winning developer sentiment. That's also why they were trying to acquire Windsurf, because they wanted to have a stronger foothold in what developers needed, as well as a place to test all these complex tool call things so they could make OpenAI models as good as the Claude models at doing this type of work. Google's also trying to do this. Gemini 2.5 Pro is a very clear attempt at trying to win developers over, and they've done multiple re-releases of the model with slight changes and shifting around of the weights in order to try and make it even better at code. That all said, they're still mediocre at tool calls. The Gemini models have a fun trait, especially 2.5 Pro, where they will clearly describe all the things they intend to do in your code base using the tools that they have access to, and then just not do it. This has been a very common problem with the Gemini models, and as a result, they tend to not be the defaults that we reach to for integrating into our services, for using in our code editors, and all these other things. There's a brief moment where 2.5 Pro is what we used in our editors, but I had enough frustration that I stopped using it relatively fast. And when Claude 4 Sonnet dropped, I kind of just stopped thinking about Gemini 2.5 Pro. It stopped being interesting to me the moment that happened. So Google doing this makes a ton of sense. Cursor, it will be sticking with Claude models until there's a good reason for them to stop. Neither Google nor OpenAI can catch up without the right tools and incentives and developer sentiment to justify it. And if both Google and OpenAI want to win developers over, they need a better starting point for that, both to improve their models in these cases and to give developers a reason to interface with them in the first place. So why do they care about devs so much? Devs choose which models win. I would guess that the majority of the inference happening for OpenAI is happening in ChatGPT and other things that OpenAI owns. I would guess less than 5%, probably less than 1% of Anthropic's inference is even happening in the Anthropic stuff. I would be incredibly surprised if Claude.ai, their crappy chat app, was more than 1% of the usage of Anthropic in the world. I'd be surprised if Anthropic's own servers were even more than 30% of all Anthropic model usage, since both Google and AWS pay a license fee in order to run Claude models on GCP and AWS through Bedrock, respectively. I would be very surprised if more than 30% of the model usage was on Anthropic servers and not other companies using both GCP and AWS to use them instead. Anthropic's success has nothing to do with Anthropic's apps, Anthropic's services, or even Anthropic's infrastructure. It has to do with how much devs like Anthropic's models. There are lots of good reasons that we like those models, but they have allowed for Anthropic to stay relevant even though their models are dumber and more expensive and slower, because they integrate in the stuff that we like, they're easier for us to build stuff around, and Anthropic has managed to stay number 3 in this race. It makes more money than the other two do often as a result. Their revenue growth has been nuts. Supposedly it went from $1 billion a year last year to around $4.5 billion a year already this year. Absolutely insane how much money Anthropic is clearing, even though nobody uses their services directly. So, if we consider the 3 players to be Anthropic, Google, and OpenAI, Anthropic has no need for Windsurf because they're already being used by Cursor and Claude Code is already winning. They don't need to have another thing or another foot in the developer tool world. OpenAI can't acquire them because of the stuff we just discussed around Microsoft. Google is who is left. There are additional problems here, though. In my opinion, the biggest by far is that Google doesn't want an antitrust case. Google's a very big company. Acquisitions like this risk government intervention. And if the government was to come in and block this acquisition, that would have really big and potentially really bad impacts on the whole AI and VC investor world around this. If AI companies don't have an opportunity to exit through something like a Google acquisition, the incentive for people to invest in these companies goes down a ton. We're talking about that even more in just a little bit. There are a lot of layers to what a case like this would look like and how it would happen, and it makes a lot of sense that Google doesn't want to deal with it. Google also doesn't want to pay full price. Windsurf is not winning the AI code editor wars at all right now. They are third or fourth or probably even potentially fifth place in what's going on there. I still personally don't know any devs that use Windsurf as their daily driver. I'm sure there are some in my audience, but they are not in my friend group. I don't know these people. So Google doesn't want to pay the full price, which was, again, that $3 billion, because there is no other place that they can go. So here are the things that we know. Google stands to benefit from being better positioned in the dev space. OpenAI can't buy Windsurf, and the Windsurf founders have probably checked out a bit mentally. Oh, and of course, the important piece, Google probably won't want to pay full price, and Google doesn't want to deal with antitrust BS. As I said before, there's no official reporting from anyone involved in this deal about what the details looked like, but I have it on good word from sources I cannot disclose that this particular article from The Information is relatively accurate. OpenAI's discussion to buy Windsurf, the maker of the popular AI coding assistant formerly known as Kodium, have ended. Instead, Google will hire the Windsurf CEO, Varun, and some of the startup staff, as well as pay for a non-exclusive license to Windsurf's technology. This is the important detail. They don't own Windsurf. Windsurf isn't theirs, but they are buying licenses for that technology so that they can use it for whatever the hell they're planning on going to do over at Google. The remaining staff and company will pivot to focus on building tools for large businesses. Very, very interesting. It is unclear how much Google is paying to license Windsurf's technology, but investors are expected to realize a positive return on their investment. Employees at the company will also get some cash from the deal, although it is unclear how much or on what terms. The other article from The Information specifies $2.4 billion for the staff, IP, and whatever else they're getting as part of this deal after the talks ended. So if we again think about this with the spectrum of who owns what, let's just take the same numbers from before, not the cash numbers, the percentage split. We'll say that investors owned 20%, employee pool was 5%, and the founder equity was 75%. The previous raise that Windsurf did, if I recall, was at a $1.5 billion valuation, which means that the investors own 20% of this $1.5 billion. A handful of these investors invested at this valuation. So if they put in, I don't know, we'll say 150 mil at the 1.5 billion, they own 10%. So if somebody invested 150 million at a 1.5 billion valuation, they put in 150 mil, and now they have 10% of this thing that might be worth something, might not be. After the talks with OpenAI started, their expectation is that they would get 300 million of OpenAI stock for the 150 mil they put in. That's a very good trade. To pay $150 million in November of last year, or whenever they raised, and then to mid this year, end up with 300 million of OpenAI stock as the trade, that's a good deal. If you had invested way earlier, you would have got an even better deal because the valuation would have been lower. But that's not what's happening. There is no stock or trade happening here. All of the equity that exists here is going to continue to exist here. Google is not getting equity in this deal. Google isn't buying out the people here. They're not going to the company and saying, we're going to pay you this much money and get back this much stock. They're paying for the product that the company has, which is their editor. That's what makes this deal so weird. Technically speaking, no equity is being purchased because Google doesn't care about the equity. They don't care about the shares. They don't care about what happens with Windsurf. Google doesn't give a single fuck if Windsurf fails. Not one. But they do want the founder, the team, and the technology because they want to ramp up their investment in building developer tools as aggressively as possible. I have a lot of inside info confirming the level of which they want to do that I am not at liberty to share. Just take my word for it. Google is trying really, really, really hard to ramp up the developer tooling side of what they are doing. But Google doesn't care about Windsurf. They just care about the IP and the people at Windsurf. They could acquire the company and then risk dealing with the antitrust BS. They could hire the founder off, but then he's not doing his fiduciary duty because when you are the founder and the CEO of a company, you have a duty to the board that is a legal obligation to do what is the best for the business in order to make the outcome as likely as possible to benefit the investors. So if you were to think of this as like Google comes in and tells the founder, hey, we'll pay you $1 billion if you quit today, everyone else's equity would go to zero immediately when they leave because there's no plan, there's no expectation of anything at all. But then the investors would have every right, and in my opinion, every reason to go sue the founder and to sue Google for that. If Google was to spend money to acquire an individual, thereby destroying the company in the process, that's illegal, and it should be. If somebody was to come to me and say, hey, Theo, we'll pay you some $100 million to quit your job at T3 Chat and come work for us, my investors should sue me unless we have an agreement where they get some amount of money as part of that transition. And that's what happened here. The deal probably, and again, we don't have any of this information on anything resembling a real record, is that instead of a traditional acquisition where a company comes in and buys stock or trades for stock and all of these people get bought out in that process, chances are through that IP license, 2.4 bill goes to Windsurf as cash, as though they had made the money doing business. And then the company can choose to pay dividends. Normally, dividends are paid as one of the methods to compensate investors. There are lots of companies where if they make enough profit, they'll split the profit across the people who have invested. Windsurf is probably going through some utter fucking chaos legally to figure out how to pay this $2.4 billion across all of the people who are involved. Since this isn't a traditional stock trade, this isn't an employee saying, okay, I own 0.5%, I will give up my percentage and get cash as a result. Instead, this is a cash payment to the investors and to the owners as a reward for being an investor and being an owner or a shareholder in the company. When Apple pays me dividends on my investment in Apple, they're not taking my stock. They are giving me money as part of my ownership, my partial investment into that business. So what's really interesting about this is that when a company like Apple has a good dividend payout, the valuation of the company goes up because more people want to come invest because they might get more money the next quarter or the next year. That's not what happens here. Before this all happened, if we take again this pool, this split existed, and this split existed at a valuation of $1.5 billion. So now what's going to happen is the split and the stock all still exists the same way. The company is without question worth significantly less money with the founding team and some of the most important staff leaving, and with a bunch of their IP no longer owned by them. Chances are they're worth less than $100 million right now. I could again be wrong. I don't know what the numbers look like internally, but they went from being $1.5 to $3 billion to being a lot less. However, the people who are in this section, those who are part of these chunks that are owners, they all got a share of the $2.4 billion that was spent on this license. So effectively what happened here is in order to apologize to the owners for having their shares go from worth billions to worth a few million at best, they're being paid a compensation prize of $2.4 billion as an apology for this business no longer being likely to succeed. The founder and team leaving means the value goes to shit. If the people in these buckets, specifically the non-founders, so if like the employees and the investors that own these shares, were to go from having these be worth hundreds of millions to a couple million, they would be getting fucked. But if you also pay them a couple billion in the process to say, hey, no, here's your money, you didn't lose out, you're making more than you would have otherwise, and there is no chance that they would have been worth even more in the future, because again, fiduciary duty, you have to do what's best for your business. I can't imagine a path out of the scenario they were in where the OpenAI acquisition failed, where they could do better than their current valuation so that people would make more money than they put in and so that the early stage employees would get paid out. So this $2.4 billion is probably the best bet to make sure everybody gets something out of their investment and out of their time and out of their shares. And Varun probably looked at this, saw the possibility, and realized that the best way to get the current shareholders paid out, especially because they were all expecting a payout now because of the OpenAI deal, the best way to get them what they wanted, to make sure that everything moves along smoothly and that the company doesn't necessarily just screw over everyone in the process, accept the fact that the valuation is too high, embrace the fact that it's going to become a lot lower, pay everybody to shut up and be okay with it, and then move on to Google in the process. That makes a ton of sense. So what happens to our friends with this much less valuable company now? I'm going to read a post from Jeff Wang, who used to be the VP at Windsurf AI. He was one of the ones that stayed behind, and he has now been appointed CEO of the new era of Windsurf. At Windsurf, we have always believed that there is a unique opportunity to channel AI to accelerate the core human desire of translating ideas into reality. Whether we're helping an individual or an organization, Windsurf's mission has always been to enable our customers to dream bigger, create whatever they want bigger, better, and faster than ever before. We build new interfaces paradigms, launch enterprise deployments capabilities, and serve millions of devs. For quite a while, the software we needed to build for our core enterprise customers aligned quite well with some other general product efforts. But there are now more varied solutions available outside of Windsurf for software devs. Given the rapid pace of innovation, we see an advantage to double down our focus on the enterprise problems, which have long been our primary focus, and we will continue to devote resources to taking the wide range of product innovations in the broader marketplace and make them work for enterprise workloads, which is the most impactful workloads to society today. I'm going to read the rest in a sec, but I want to dive into this part because I've mentioned this before when I talked about Windsurf. If you were to take devs and put them on a spectrum, where on one side of this you have new devs and vibe coders that don't really understand the stuff that they're doing or writing, and on the other side here you have people still writing COBOL in 2025, like the most enterprisey of the enterprise. This range has a lot of different needs and expectations. Someone on this side might not care about things like error reporting or test-driven development. They're going to care more about how quickly can it generate a new page for me? How good does the CSS look? How nice and easy of an experience is this for me to use? People on this side are going to care more about, is there a plugin for JetBrains? Or they're going to care about how well it handles test-driven development or how strictly it will follow the rules you give it. The needs of these two sides are very different. And this range is a very interesting problem that our friends over at Windsurf had to deal with. Initially, Windsurf was really focused on this side on the right here. They were building the plugins for tools that nobody else wanted to. As far as I know, they still have one of the best AI assistant tools for using things like JetBrains. That's what Kodium was, which was the original purpose of their business. Then Cursor started to take off. And the idea of a forked editor that gave you more integrated AI capabilities was more and more appealing. And they saw some of their customers churning, and they saw a huge interest from this other side on the left here with crazy growth, crazy metrics, crazy everything. We've all seen those numbers. When you win this side and you build a tool that can slowly expand over to the right from there, you can make a ton of money. The success of Cursor kind of forced Kodium to rethink what they were doing. They were making a significant amount of money and own a significant amount of the market on this far right side of the enterprisiest of the enterprises. But Cursor had really carved out this section in the middle for themselves. Cursor was very quickly winning the middle ground between people who have no idea how to code and people who still think COBOL is a reasonable language. Meanwhile, our friends over at Windsurf won the Java devs. Kodium really had this section over here. I think it was code with an E. There's a bunch of Kodiums. You get the idea. Kodium was Windsurf. They were winning here. They saw how big the market Cursor was winning was, but they also saw the opportunity over here on this side. So they went over here and tried their best to win this section. Going to give this a checkered and dotted because they didn't necessarily win it. There's a lot of people competing for this range, which is interesting because it's also the range where there is the least profit because these aren't people who make a lot of money. These are people who make too much money but suck to sell to. And Windsurf had kind of split their business, where the things they were working on were either for the newbiest of noobs that needed help learning how the terminal works, or the enterprisiest of enterprises that are still working in Eclipse and JetBrains and crazy things that none of us would want to touch, primarily. The types of people who don't really watch my videos. Their ultimate goal was to push towards the middle in hopes that everything would collide and they would be able to win a significant portion of the general market. But instead, they had to fight on both sides to keep Cursor from invading into their turf. And that's not fun. If you have customers here that you won that aren't going anywhere, but need more help, but all your development effort is here trying to fight Cursor, you are struggling a lot as a business to figure out where to put your time and efforts, especially if the founder is spending all of their time raising money, talking acquisitions, and doing whatever they have to set up the business for success. That kind of left an opportunity for someone else to come in. A big part of why the OpenAI acquisition would have made sense is they would have had a way for a bunch of beginner devs that use stuff like Lovable to start using OpenAI tools more directly, and they would have an in for these enterprises that are still relying on these tools every day for working in these giant, miserable code bases. And Cursor could continue doing their thing in the middle. Google is already good at this section. They're not great at it, but Google, believe it or not, they're a pretty big company that's pretty aware of how to do things in this enterprise world. They couldn't give less of a shit about what others are doing here because Google kind of by default wins. At the very least, the companies on this side are already paying Google for G Suite, so it is what it is. Google is struggling a ton on this side. This is the same reason they bought Firebase forever ago, and we know how that investment's going for them. They don't know how to win this area. They don't even know how to compete in this area. But Windsurf does. I hope it's not a hot take to say that people who get really hyped on Windsurf come off kind of like noobs, because the benefits of Windsurf over Cursor are mostly benefits for people who aren't that into coding or just don't have that much experience. It's kind of become a self-own to say that you think Windsurf is way better than Cursor for that reason, because it really is a little skewed towards beginners. So the way that Google chose to split is to just draw a big line between the two. Google takes the left. What's left of Windsurf, or now Kodium again, takes the right. They paid $2.4 billion to take this part, and they left this to the people at Windsurf who want to keep building and maintaining it and fighting in the enterprise world that Google just isn't interested in competing in right now because they've already largely won it. And that's what this post is trying to say without going quite into the detail that I did there. We're excited to announce that Windsurf and Google have entered into an agreement that will help kickstart this next phase. As part of the agreement, Varun, Douglas, and some members of our R&D team will be joining Google. Most of Windsurf's world-class team will continue to build the Windsurf product for enterprises and enable our customers to maximize the outcomes from adopting this technology. Effective immediately, Jeff Huang, who used to be the head of business, has stepped into the role of interim CEO. He's been part of Windsurf's journey since mid-2023, and he's served across many roles and capacities as the team has expanded and our projects have grown more ambitious. Simultaneously, Graham Marino, the previous VP of Global Sales, has stepped into the role of president. He has been the undeniable driving force of the enterprise business that has grown at a rate that few enterprise software businesses have had the success to do. We thank Varun and Douglas and all the others for bringing Windsurf into the position it's in today, serving thousands of enterprises and millions of devs, and look forward to building on top of their work with a clear, renewed focus on making enterprises of all sizes, industries, and maturities as successful as possible with Windsurf. That actually has one detail I should have mentioned here before. The side on the left here burns a ton of money, but also has potential to be super valuable. The right side here makes a decent profit, but is much slower to grow and higher chance of slowly dying. On the left side, if you're not raising money and you're letting users pay $10 a month to do $50 of inference, you're burning money fast here. And if you can't raise enough to keep going, you're going to have to raise your prices instead, and then you deal with what Cursor's currently dealing with. But if you're on the other side here, you can probably stand to go a lot longer because enterprises will pay more, use less, and honestly, I would be surprised if after this change, Kodium isn't profitable or close to it with what is left. I could be wrong, but if they mostly gut Windsurf and the free tier and all of the stuff there in favor of letting Google re-release it under whatever banner they choose to, the independent Windsurf users paying $10 a month can just move to whatever Google does. And the existing Kodium enterprise users will keep paying what they were paying before, and what's left of the business might not be worth anywhere near as much as Windsurf could have been, but at least it makes money, and at least these people aren't losing their jobs or their opportunities, and most importantly, the enterprises who bet on Kodium can continue using it and not feel super burned about whatever's going on here. I think that covers most of it. To quickly recap, Google gets a huge leg up in the developer tooling space. Core team on Windsurf IDE specifically now work at Google and have their IP. So the editor, all the fun things they built and invented for the Windsurf editor, they get to keep with them as they move to Google. They also now get to play the Google politics and wars, but don't have to worry about raising money. That's a big deal. Founders never again have to deal with fundraising or other related BS. Windsurf, the IDE, will probably die in favor of whatever Google replaces it with. And Kodium, what remains of Windsurf, is now probably profitable, will continue to exist and serve enterprises. And investors in Windsurf got paid enough money to not get pissy and just move on. Which again is an important detail because it would have been a disaster if those investors had just spent a bunch of their time suing after everything that happened here. What a journey this was. I thought this would be a short video. Who was I kidding? I hope this is helpful for you guys. I am so deep in this business, investor, crazy startup world that I at least know enough to kind of understand the details here. There's a lot of stuff going around that is effectively misinformation, a bunch of which I even believed. It was my assumption that Google had originally just paid the founders to quit and come join them, and that would result in a disaster. Knowing about this weird licensing deal and everything makes this all make way more sense. Oh, God, this was chaotic. I hope that this helped you understand what's going on here. Let me know how you feel about deals like this and also content like this. I know y'all are here for me covering engineering stuff, and this is much more of the business side, but I don't know who else is going to cover this stuff, right? It's pretty in the weeds. Let me know what y'all think. And until next time, peace, nerds.